This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Dr. David Gussak about his new book, The Frenzied Dance of Art and Violence. Gussak's new book examines violence as a touchstone throughout the history of art, from artists like Caravaggio, who struggled with violent behavior, including murder, to artists like Picasso, whose work was influenced by atrocities, to the paintings and drawings of infamous serial killers. In our conversation, Dr. Gussak guides us through the psychological analysis of violence's role in the art-making process, while also providing insights from his decades of professional experience in art therapy for the incarcerated. And now, my conversation regarding the frenzied dance of art and violence with Dr. David Gussak. Dr. David Gussak, thank you so much for joining me today on the Art Sense podcast to talk about your new book, The Frenzied Dance of Art and Violence. That's an upcoming publication, so tell us a little bit about your book and where it started and how you got going.
Well, actually, it may be a good idea to start from the beginning where it all came from, because I think it took me about 8 years to write this book. It really is a culmination of about 30 years of work as an art therapist. And I've been an art therapist for that long. And I began even before that working with aggressive adolescents in Southern California, working with gang members in a facility on a locked acute unit. And I saw that a lot of the work that they were producing was a way for them to facilitate connection, interaction, identity. And I had started working in a prison shortly after graduating with my master's degree. So I had been working a lot with violent and aggressive people and seeing that the art was a valuable means for them to redirect, sublimate their aggressive and violent impulses, create nonverbal means of expression and ways to connect and feel that there was a person that would accept who they were through the very art. I mean, that's 30 years of work culminating in 18 words. But this book, The Frenzied Dance of Art and Violence, actually emerged from a conversation that I had with a previous editor from a book that was published and released in 2013, which was Art on Trial, Art Therapy in Capital Murder Cases, in which I wrote about my experience as an expert witness for a death row murder trial. And while I was speaking with my editor, Jennifer Perillo at Columbia University Press at the time, we started just talking like we always do. And she had discovered that I had been asked to do a series of lectures to reflect on the work of John-Wayne-Gacy, the serial killer out of Chicago. And I had gone to Las Vegas to speak about this work and reflect on it and see what it may reveal, what it may reflect, and kind of explore the notion of why such violent people may have created. And she was surprised when not only that he had done that work, but that there were a lot of serial killers and multiple murderers who had created a lot of artwork. And she had actually suggested at the time that there was a book in this. And quite frankly, I didn't want to do that. I thought that the notion of doing a book on the work of serial killers would kind of propagate the very essence of what they wanted, which was an ongoing immortality, so to speak. That this would reinforce the narcissism and grandiosity. And so I said, I just didn't think that was a good idea. But the more I reflected on that, the more I realized, and I started digging deeper, that although I knew for all these years that art and art therapy was beneficial for violent and aggressive populations, as I started digging deeper, I realized that there was already a natural relationship between art and aggression, and by extension, art and violence. Ellen Desenayake, one of my favorite people, she's in what you might consider a cultural anthropologist, wrote in some of her early works back in the 90s, which really fueled some of my early work, which was that there was already an existing relationship between creativity and libidinal, and basically what she said was that the impulses that drive some people to violence are the same impulses that drive people to create, or drive artists to create, and that there have been lots of literature that do indeed link impulsive and aggressive tendencies towards art making. And so what I realized, that while I was always concerned about how art can help mitigate, redirect, sublimate aggressive and violent energy, I'm also realizing that creative endeavors emerge from and rely on those same aggressive and violent impulses. So I saw it as almost a frenzied tango, which I thought was just a two-sided, two sides of the same coin, two sides of the same dancing relationship. But then I realized that it was a lot messier than that. And so when I started looking at the work of serial killers, I was realizing that for them, art was a tool or a weapon, and didn't set aside aggressive and violent tendencies, and certainly wasn't fed by a sublimation of their energy, but was rather an extension of their grandiosity, narcissism, and, for lack of a better way of saying it, further ways to attack the very people that looked at the work.
It's my impression that you kind of peel away that onion by looking at artists from art history who expressed violent nature, artists from art history whose work was maybe not necessarily inspired, but took a certain energy from violence that had occurred in their life. And then the third piece being these characteristically violent people who just happened to make art, right? What do we see in terms of overlap?
Well, the overlap is and I think the way you just summarized it was beautifully said, so much better than the way I said it. But the overlap is that there is already an existing psychic energy and a drive that exists with the aggressive and in some cases violent tendencies that drives a person to create. That there's already a natural relationship between creativity and the drive to make art. Now, I think there's the overlap in the case of those whose byproducts of their narcissistic and grandiosity were products. I wouldn't necessarily say they were creative, but they were all exhibited through products that demonstrated their already existing psychic energy. And so, when you're looking at historically, what I discovered, of course, were, and this was actually kind of a lot of fun. As this project continued, I tried to keep somewhat limited because of the size of the book. I didn't want it to be an encyclopedia. I would start looking at artists who were considered violent by nature. And so, of course, absolutely Caravaggio fit in there, and Cellini fit in there. And then Dali was a no-brainer. And then, of course, Jackson Pollock emerged, but his work was much more of a very controlled chaos, and a very much of a way to contain that frenetic energy that was released into violence if it was unrestrained because of alcohol or drugs, similar to Modigliani and then Richard Dad, who had a mental illness. But then I started looking at those who used art as a means of controlling and containing and feeling a sense of escape or safety in very violent surroundings. And those were people like Goya, who tried to make sense of the wars around him through that imagery. You had Max Beckman and Felix Nussbaum, but you also had vann-nath and Bill Traylor. And surprisingly, a lot of people were surprised that I included somebody like Norman Rockwell in there, who's towards the later end of his career, when he was unrestrained by having to do covers for the Saturday Evening Post, all of a sudden started really expressing the conflict that was going on in the world and in the country, and did it in such a way that was so captivating and almost, I hate to say it this way, but it was almost validating when somebody like Bill Traylor, who had experienced slavery and Jim Crow and was held down because of the color of her skin, and his artwork contained all of this energy and this reflection of all of this aggression and violence against him. And he dies in a pauper's grave because he's Black. And then you have Norman Rockwell, who's, as a witness, right, capturing the very same unfairness and horrors that Traylor experienced. He's witnessing, but his art is given a lot more visibility because he's white. And so I'm trying to untangle some of those things, but they were, as far as I was concerned, two sides of the same coin. And that made sense to me, that there was these artists that, that relied on this aggression and violence to create their natural tendencies. And there were these artists that used the art to escape. And then, like I said, all of a sudden everything gets thrown out of kilter when I'm looking at the work of the serial killer. There's actually one chapter in there that looks at the continuum along, if you take the segment of the Holocaust. Many people do know that Adolf Hitler was a self-professed artist. But his art, very much like those of the mass murderers, the multiple murderers, were devoid of emotion, and they were technical, and they were banal. They were, quite frankly, they were inhuman. And he did it, and he made this art to try and further his own narcissistic grandiosity, because at that time art was considered a viable, it would be self-validating. And so on the other side of that spectrum, you have these incredible artists that emerged who were victims of the Holocaust. You've got the artists from the Terezin incident, like Unger and Trawler, and their work. And then you've got some of the works that were discovered and they were, found in Auschwitz and the ghettos, like Wozniak, and their art was so much more expressive and so much more life affirming, right? And they were compelled to create, knowing full well that if their art was discovered, they would be destroyed. And yet they couldn't hold back. They needed this to rehumanize them, gain a sense of identity when everything else was going to be destroyed. Their art was fed by what was going on around them.
I'm sure you had to do quite a bit of research into psychology and neuroscience, in writing the book. But is there a particular part of the limbic system that we see as being involved? I mean, it seems like part of this is related to impulse control, which I guess would be the prefrontal cortex, or is it something bigger? I mean, is it something that is more related to, I guess, it's probably all over the place, right? Because part of this is, like you said, grandiosity and narcissism. It probably just depends on, which artist we're talking about and exactly what their particular inputs and psyches were, right?
That's a really interesting question, because I don't think it's necessarily has to do with the artist. I think it has to do with the person who's looking at the art, meaning, or the person who's trying to theorize about this. In the chapters, I actually break down the various theoretical and positions, psychological and sociological concepts of where violence and aggression derives from. So there's a section in the introduction. The introduction is fairly lengthy, and it's called the Art of Violence, the Violence of Art. And it's about, and it looks at where aggression and violence may emerge from the neurological standpoint, the limbic system, the dopamine, I have to be honest, it's been so long since I wrote that section that I was actually reading the book again just before this meeting and trying to be reacquainted. And so, but there's certainly some wonderful theoretical positions on how where aggression and violence resides in the brain, neurologically speaking, and how art helps release and express and mitigate some of those neurological storms that may exist. Some of my early studies really examined how art facilitated an improvement in locus of control, moving from external to internal, which is, of course, a neurological and a cognitive behavioral concept. Yet I also examined how violence and